Roman Volkov did not trust easily. In fact, trust was a luxury he had stripped out of his life, the same way you strip rust from a blade. Carefully, completely, and without sentiment. He had built his empire on suspicion, survived 3 finishing attempts through paranoia, and kept himself alive for 38 years by questioning everything and everyone around him. So when his maid started lying to him, he noticed immediately. It wasn't dramatic. There were no obvious tells, no nervous sweat, no trembling hands. Emily was good, better than she probably realized. But Roman was better. It started on a Tuesday. He had come downstairs earlier than usual, still buttoning his cufflinks, expecting to find the kitchen empty. Instead, he caught the tail end of a phone call, Emily's back to him, her voice low and quick, saying, "I'll be there by 7, I promise." She hung up the moment she sensed him in the room, turned around, smiled the same easy smile she always wore, open, a little tired around the edges, completely unassuming. "Good morning, Mr. Volkov. Coffee's ready." He said nothing, sat down, drank his coffee, but he watched her hands while she moved around the kitchen. They were steady, too steady for someone who had nothing to hide. Nervous people fidgeted. Guilty people performed calm. Emily's hands were performing. He filed it away and said nothing. 3 days later, she asked to leave an hour early. "Errands," she said simply, not quite meeting his eyes. "I have some things I need to take care of." In 12 months of working for him, Emily had never once asked to leave early. She showed up before anyone else and stayed later than she needed to. Roman had actually wondered once, briefly, whether she had anywhere else to go. Now she had errands. At 6 in the evening, on a Thursday. "Go," he said. She thanked him, changed out of her uniform faster than he had ever seen her move, and was out the gate in under 4 minutes. He watched her from the upstairs window, watched her pull her coat tight around her. She was a heavy-set woman, Emily, soft-faced and quiet, with the kind of presence that made people look past her without meaning to. She walked quickly, head down, turning left at the gate, instead of right, toward the bus stop she always used. Roman stood at the window for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and called his driver. "The car, now, and leave the men behind." He had expected something operational. That was the honest truth. As his car maintained a careful distance behind Emily's moving figure through 2 buses and a rattling metro ride, Roman's mind had already constructed 3 separate theories. An informant she was feeding, a rival family she was in contact with, a journalist, maybe. There were always journalists trying to find angles into his world through the people closest to him. He was calm about it, almost clinical. If Emily had been turned against him, it would be disappointing. She was good at her job, and he disliked hiring. But it would not be the first time someone in his inner circle had made that particular mistake. He would deal with it the way he dealt with everything. Quietly, permanently. The metro let her off at a station he barely recognized, a part of the city that existed in a different economic universe from the one Roman occupied. Cracked pavements, rusted fire escapes clinging to the sides of old buildings like they were too tired to let go. A pharmacy with bars on the windows, a corner store with half its sign missing. Emily walked 2 blocks without hesitating, turned into the entrance of a gray apartment building that looked like it had been waiting decades for someone to finally demolish it, and disappeared inside. Roman parked further down the street and waited. 20 minutes passed. A light came on. 3rd floor, 2nd window from the left. He watched that window. Through the glass, softened by dirty curtains and distance, he could see Emily moving. She had tied an apron around her coat. She was in a kitchen, washing dishes, then cooking, something steaming, something that took time. She moved around the small space, with the same quiet efficiency she brought to his own kitchen. Except here, there was something different in the way she moved, slower, more careful, like she was trying not to startle someone. Then Roman saw why. An old man came into the frame, shuffling, bent slightly at the back, one hand trailing along the wall for balance. White-haired, thin in the way that people become thin when they have been unwell for a long time. He lowered himself into a chair near the window, and Emily set a bowl in front of him, said something that made him look up at her with an expression Roman hadn't seen on anyone's face in a very long time. Gratitude, pure and uncomplicated, and real. Roman sat absolutely still in the dark car. He had come here expecting treachery. What he was looking at instead was an overworked maid spending her evening cooking dinner for a sick old man who had no one else. It was so far from everything he had prepared himself for that for a moment his mind simply refused to process it. He leaned forward slightly, studying the old man's profile through the window. And then the man turned his head, just slightly, just enough, and the weak apartment light fell across a face that Roman had not seen in 20 years. A face that was older now, hollowed out, worn down by time and something harder than time, but unmistakable. Roman's hand found the door handle without him deciding to reach for it, then stopped. His whole body stopped. He sat there in the dark, not breathing, while 20 years of buried fury and something else, something he would not name, crashed through him like a wave breaking through a dam that had been holding it back for far, far too long. He let go of the door handle, started the engine, and drove home without looking back. His jaw locked so tight it ached, his hands steady on the wheel only because he had spent decades learning how to keep them that way. His father was alive, and his maid had known. Roman did not sleep that night. He lay in his bed, the wide, silent, expensive bed that occupied the center of a room most people would consider a luxury hotel suite, and stared at the ceiling with his hands folded on his chest, like a man already in a coffin. The house was completely quiet around him. It was always quiet. Roman had designed his life to be quiet. Right now, the quiet felt like pressure. Victor Volkov. He had spent 20 years constructing the story of his father, the way you construct a wall, brick by brick, each one a reason, a proof, a certainty. Victor had walked out. Victor had chosen freedom over family. Victor had looked at a wife and a young son and decided, coldly and without guilt, that there were better things waiting for him somewhere else. That wall had been useful. It had kept Roman from feeling certain things. It had turned grief into anger, and anger into fuel, and fuel into the kind of ruthless forward momentum that built empires. Now a small crack had appeared at the base of it. Roman closed his eyes and replaced it with something more manageable. Suspicion. Emily knew. Emily had been going there, to that apartment, to that man, and saying nothing. Every morning she had stood in his kitchen, made his coffee, arranged his schedule, and carried this secret around behind her easy smile. 12 months of it. The question was not whether she was hiding something. She clearly was. The question was how much she knew, and why she had said nothing, and what exactly connected a run-down old man in a crumbling apartment to the maid working inside the home of that old man's son. Roman sat up at 4 in the morning and went to his desk. By 6 a.m., he had made 3 calls, all to people who owed him answers and knew better than to deliver anything less. The results, by late afternoon, were almost insultingly thin. Victor Volkov, as far as Roman's contacts could trace, did not exist in that neighborhood. The man in the apartment was registered under a completely different surname, one that appeared nowhere in Roman's intelligence network because it was ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of name that belonged to nobody in particular, which was precisely why it worked. Whoever had built that identity had understood that the best hiding place is not the shadows, it is the middle of the crowd. Roman stared at the single sheet of information on his desk. No criminal record under the new name, no known associates. A small pension, a medical history that suggested a man who had been quietly declining in health for several years, and a lease on that apartment going back almost a decade. A decade. His father had been less than 40 minutes from Roman's mansion for a decade. He pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose and breathed slowly. There was one more thing he needed to know: how Emily fit into this, whether her presence there was accidental or arranged, whether someone had placed her in his home deliberately, or whether this was something stranger and harder to categorize. He would follow her again. The second evening he was more prepared. He kept further back this time. He had also, for the first time in years, dressed down. No coat that cost more than most people's monthly salary. No details that would draw a second glance. He looked, he hoped, like nobody in particular. Emily took the same metro line but got off 1 stop earlier, and Roman felt the first shift of unease in his chest before he understood why. She wasn't going to the apartment directly. She turned instead toward a different block entirely and stopped outside a building with a small, faded sign above the door. A free medical clinic. Roman positioned himself across the street, half behind a parked truck, and watched. 10 minutes later, Victor came around the corner. He was moving slowly, one hand gripping a thin metal cane Roman hadn't noticed from a distance the night before. He was dressed cleanly, but poorly. A coat too light for the weather, shoes that had been resoled at least twice. Emily appeared from inside the clinic doorway, spotted him, and walked to him quickly, taking his free arm, the way you take the arm of someone whose balance you no longer fully trust. They went inside together. Roman stood in the cold for over an hour. When they came back out, Emily was carrying a small paper bag. Medication, Roman assumed. Victor was talking. Emily was listening, with her head tilted slightly, the way she did when she was paying genuine attention, rather than politely pretending to. At one point, Victor stopped walking and said something that made her laugh. A real laugh, quick and unguarded, and the old man smiled at the sound of it with an expression that hit Roman somewhere behind the sternum. Roman had never once made Emily laugh like that. He had never tried. He watched her pay the clinic's outstanding balance from a small purse she kept tucked inside her coat. Her own money, her savings. She was paying for an old man's medicine on a maid's salary, without being asked, without hesitation, without apparently expecting anything in return. Roman turned away before they could start back. He walked 2 blocks in the wrong direction just to have somewhere to put the feeling building behind his ribs, a feeling he hadn't been equipped to handle since he was 8 years old. She knew something about his father that he didn't. He told himself this while walking to the metro station alone for the first time in longer than he could remember, hands in his pockets, collar up against the wind. He told himself he was simply gathering information. That was all this was. Intelligence work. The same thing he did every day, applied to a personal inconvenience. He almost believed it. This time, Emily did not go to the clinic. She went straight to the apartment building, and she was carrying things. 2 heavy bags that pulled at her shoulders, stuffed with groceries. Roman watched her wrestle them through the entrance door without anyone holding it open for her, and felt something flicker in his chest that he chose to ignore. He found a position across the street, where a broken street lamp gave him enough shadow to stand without being obvious about it. The light in Victor's window came on within minutes. Through it, Roman watched a different kind of evening unfold. Emily had brought supplies. Not just food, but tools. A bucket, a roll of tape, something wrapped in plastic that turned out, when she unwrapped it, to be a patch kit for pipes. The apartment had a leaking wall, Roman realized. He could see the dark stain spreading across the plaster near the window, even from here. Emily rolled up her sleeves and went to work on it, while Victor sat in his chair and watched her with the quiet helplessness of a man who had already tried and failed to fix it himself. They talked the entire time. Roman could not hear words from across the street, but he could read the rhythm of it. Victor talking at length, hands moving slowly in his lap, and Emily responding in short bursts, between bouts of focused work, occasionally turning to ask a question, occasionally laughing at something that required no explanation. It had the texture of a friendship that had already found its natural shape. Comfortable, unperformed. He watched for nearly 2 hours. The following evening, he came back without deciding to. This time, the window showed something quieter. Emily, sitting across from Victor at the small kitchen table. No tools, no task, just the two of them, with cups of something hot. Victor was talking more than Emily. His hands moved differently tonight, slower, more deliberate, like a man handling something fragile. Memory, Roman recognized. The particular gestures people made when they were handling memory. Roman pressed his back against the cold brick wall and stared at the yellow square of that window a long time. He needed to understand how this had started. Not for any operational reason, not because it affected his plans or his security or his network, simply because there was a version of this that made sense, and a version that didn't, and he could not locate himself inside either one until he had the beginning of the story. He got it 3 days later, not through surveillance, but through accident. He had arrived earlier than usual that evening, and positioned himself in the shadow of the stairwell entrance across the street. Victor's window was still dark. Emily hadn't arrived yet. But an elderly woman from the ground floor apartment was standing outside with a small dog, and she was talking to a man Roman didn't recognize. A neighbor, clearly. Someone who knew the building well. Roman was close enough to hear them over the quiet street if he paid attention. He paid attention. "The old man on the 3rd floor," the woman was saying, shaking her head. "He collapsed right there on that pavement, you know, back in spring. Nobody stopped. Nobody. Just walked around him like he was rubbish left on the street. Nobody called anyone? Nobody did anything, except that girl, the one who visits him now. She was just passing through the neighborhood, apparently. Didn't know him from anyone. She stopped. She called the emergency line. She sat with him on the ground until someone came, held his hand the whole time." The woman made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He asked her name before they took him away. She came back to check on him the next day, and the day after that. The neighbor said something Roman didn't catch. "Every day," the woman confirmed. "Almost every day since spring." She says he reminds her of her grandfather, the one who raised her. She paused. "He's alone, you know. No family." That's what he told her. No family left. Roman's jaw tightened. No family left. The words sat in his chest, like something swallowed wrong. Victor had told Emily he had no family, had built his invisible life so completely that he had apparently convinced himself that was true, or had decided it was the kindest lie to tell a kind woman who would ask fewer questions if the answer was simple and final. And Emily, who owed Victor nothing, who had been a stranger on a pavement, who had her own life and her own exhaustion and her own reasons to keep walking, had stopped, had come back, had made a promise to a man she barely knew, just because no one else had. Roman stood in the cold long after the woman and her dog went inside. He had spent 20 years believing his father had abandoned him. His father, it turned out, had convinced the whole world he had no son. The wall that Roman had built, brick by careful brick, developed another crack. Roman made a mistake. He was experienced enough to recognize it only after it had already happened, which was the worst kind, the kind where the damage was already moving through the system before you had even registered the error. He had been so consumed by Emily, by Victor, by the quiet earthquake happening inside his own chest, that he had done something he had not done in 15 years, of surviving in a world that finished careless men without ceremony. He had been predictable, 3 evenings in a row, same general direction, same time frame, no security detail, no counter-surveillance, no variation in pattern. For an ordinary man, that was simply routine. For Roman Volkov, it was an open invitation. He realized it on the drive home from the 3rd evening, when he noticed a gray saloon car, 2 vehicles behind him, that had been 2 vehicles behind him the previous night as well. Same position, different plates, but the same small dent above the rear left wheel arch. Roman's eyes stayed on the mirror for 30 seconds. Then he picked up his phone and called Marco, his head of security. "We have a watcher," he said. "I need to know who owns a gray Lancia, dented rear left arch, new plates probably switched in the last 48 hours. Find it." He hung up before Marco could ask questions he didn't want to answer yet. Specifically, questions about why Roman had been traveling alone at night without telling anyone. Marco called back before midnight. The car traced back through 2 layers of false registration to a shell company Roman recognized immediately. Not because it was famous, because it was deliberately invisible, in a way that only people with resources and reasons made things invisible. It belonged, at its untraceable root, to the Ferry family. Roman sat with that information for a long moment. The Ferris were the one rival family that had survived long enough and stayed smart enough to remain a genuine problem. They operated differently from Roman, less disciplined, more brutal, with the particular recklessness of people who had decided that fear was a more reliable currency than respect. They had been watching his edges for 2 years, looking for a weakness, finding nothing, because Roman had made sure there was nothing to find. Until now. The question that landed cold in the center of Roman's thinking was not how the Ferris had spotted his movements. That was secondary. The question that mattered was what they had seen when they followed him. Had they simply observed Roman moving through an unfamiliar neighborhood without his men? Or had they watched carefully enough to see where he stopped? What window he stood beneath? What old man moved behind that glass? Roman closed his eyes briefly. If the Ferris had identified Victor, if they had traced even a thread of connection between that crumbling apartment and Roman Volkov, then the calculation for them was simple and brutal. Victor would not be a person to them. He would be a lever, the kind of leverage that could bring a feared man to his knees faster than any weapon. He called Marco again. "I need eyes on a building." He gave the address. Quietly. "Nobody goes close, nobody makes contact. I just need to know if anyone else is watching it." "Who are we looking for?" "Ferry people." A pause. Marco understood what that meant. "How quickly do you need this?" "Yesterday," Roman said, and ended the call. The report came back within 18 hours. 2 men, rotating shifts, positioned at either end of the block. A 3rd vehicle, a dark van, parked on the parallel street with a sightline to the building's rear entrance. Professional enough to avoid obvious patterns, but not professional enough to fool people who were specifically looking for them. The Ferris were already there. Roman read the report twice, set it down, and sat very still at his desk. The anger that moved through him was different from the anger he was accustomed to carrying, the cold, managed, operational kind that he could point at problems like a tool. This was something rawer, something that had sharp edges and no handle. They were watching his father, a sick old man with a cane and a leaking wall, and a maid who paid for his medicine out of her own pocket. They were watching him because they thought he could be used. Roman stood up and walked to the window. In the street below, his world continued its normal operations. Cars moving, men positioned, the quiet machinery of power running its familiar course. None of them new. Nobody in his organization knew that Victor existed, that the old man in that apartment was the single structural weakness in Roman Volkov's otherwise impenetrable life. Which meant Emily didn't know either. She was walking into that neighborhood every evening, carrying groceries, fixing pipes, sitting across from Victor while the Ferry family built a wall of surveillance around them both. She had noticed nothing because she had no reason to notice. She was not a woman who lived in a world where being kind to a lonely old man could get you finished. Roman's hand pressed flat against the cold glass of the window. He had spent 3 weeks standing in the shadows, watching, waiting, gathering information, while the distance between him and Victor remained safely theoretical. That distance had just run out. Roman had a plan. It was measured, careful, and sensible, the kind of plan that his best strategic instincts had constructed overnight, while the rawer part of him wanted to do something far less measured. He would quietly relocate Victor without making contact. A safe house, anonymous, outside the city. He would have Marco handle the logistics through channels that couldn't be traced back to him. Victor would simply disappear from that apartment the same way he had disappeared from Roman's life, completely, without explanation. Emily would arrive one evening to find the apartment empty. Roman would say nothing. Victor would be safe. The Ferris would lose their leverage without ever having had the chance to use it. And the situation, the entire complicated, emotionally inconvenient situation, would resolve itself without Roman having to stand in the same room as his father for the first time in 20 years. It was a good plan. He gave himself until Friday to execute it. On Thursday evening, his phone rang. It was one of Marco's surveillance men, the one watching the north end of Victor's block. "Something is moving," the man said, voice tight. "3 vehicles. They're not rotating anymore. They're positioning." Roman was already on his feet. "How many men?" "I count 6. Maybe more in the van. They're moving toward the building entrance." Roman looked at the clock. 6:47. Emily would have arrived 13 minutes ago. He knew her schedule now the way he knew his own. She was already up there, probably in the kitchen, probably with her apron on, completely unaware that the street below her had just changed character entirely. He grabbed his coat. "Don't engage," he told the surveillance man. "Hold your position, I'm coming." He took 4 of his own men in one vehicle. No time for more. He drove himself. He was 8 minutes away. They felt like the longest 8 minutes of his life, and Roman Volkov had lived through some extraordinarily long minutes. He kept his speed controlled because arriving at an accident was worse than arriving late, and he kept his phone to his ear, getting updates from the street. The ferrymen had entered the building, 2 staying outside at the exits. The van engine still running. The van engine still running meant this was a grab, not a hit. They wanted Victor alive. That at least bought seconds. He was still 2 minutes out when his surveillance man's voice came back sharp and high. "They've got him. Ground floor. They're bringing him out through the side entrance. The woman is there. She's getting in the way." Roman's foot went harder on the accelerator. "The woman. The maid. She followed them down. She's blocking the side door. She's—" A pause filled with background noise, shouting, something hitting something hard. "She's not moving. They're trying to push past her, and she's not moving." He came around the corner to a scene that would stay with him longer than he would ever admit. Emily was standing in the narrow side doorway of the building, with her arms braced against both sides of the frame, physically blocking the exit, while 2 men tried to drag Victor past her toward the waiting van. She was not armed, she was not trained. She was a heavy-set woman in a winter coat with a grocery apron still tied around her waist, and she was holding that doorframe with everything she had, buying seconds with sheer stubbornness, while Victor, confused, frightened, gripping his cane, was pressed against the wall behind her. One of the men shoved her hard enough that she stumbled, nearly lost her footing, and caught herself on the frame again. She did not move from the door. Roman's car hadn't fully stopped before he was out of it. What followed was brief and not clean, and entirely decisive. 4 of Roman's men against 6 of the Ferris, in a narrow side street, at dusk. The ferry men were not expecting resistance at all. They had come for a defenseless old man, not a counter-operation. The surprise alone cost them several seconds, and several seconds was all it took. 2 ran. 2 were restrained. The van reversed at speed and was gone before Roman's men could block it. The whole thing lasted under 90 seconds. In the silence that followed, Roman turned. Victor had been guided away from the wall by Emily, who was checking his face with both hands, asking him something, her voice low and urgent. Victor was shaken but unhurt, nodding slowly, trying to reassure her with the unsteady dignity of a man who refuses to be seen as fragile. Then Victor looked up. His eyes found Roman across the narrow space between them, across 20 years, across everything that had been said and everything that had never been said, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Roman stood in the cold evening air and looked at his father's face up close, for the first time since he was a boy. Older, smaller than memory. The lines around his eyes deep enough to keep secrets in. Victor's mouth opened slightly. No words came. Roman looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. Then he turned away, nodded to Marco, and got back into the car. He did not trust his voice enough to use it. The safe house was 2 hours outside the city. It sat at the end of an unpaved track, surrounded by pine trees that blocked it from the road on 3 sides, with a single lamp burning above the door, like something out of a painting that hadn't decided yet whether it was peaceful or lonely. Roman had used it twice before, both times for situations that required absolute quiet and absolute privacy. This qualified. He had arranged everything through Marco with the same controlled efficiency he brought to any operational necessity. Victor had been transported separately, in a vehicle with tinted windows and no conversation. Emily had been brought in Roman's own car, which she had entered without protest, but with a silence so loaded it had weight. She had not said a single word for the entire 2-hour drive. Neither had Roman. The safe house had a main room with a fireplace that Marco's people had already lit, a kitchen stocked with basics, and a table large enough for 3 people to sit around without being close enough to touch. Roman had specifically requested the table. He needed the structure of it, the formality, something that would keep this from becoming the kind of conversation that happened on its feet, with raised voices and nowhere to put your hands. Victor was already seated when Roman came in from the cold. He had a blanket across his knees that someone had brought without being asked, and a cup of tea he wasn't drinking, and he looked, Roman noted this with a feeling he couldn't name, like a man who had been waiting for this room for a very long time. Emily sat down without being invited. Roman noticed that too. She positioned herself not beside Victor in a way that suggested allegiance, and not beside Roman in a way that suggested loyalty, but exactly between them, slightly back from the table, present but not intrusive, like a person who understood that their role here was to hold the room together if it started to come apart. Roman sat down, looked at Victor, said nothing. Victor spoke first. "I know what this looks like," Victor said. His voice was older, rougher at the edges, like a familiar road that had weathered badly. "I know what you've believed for 20 years, and I know that nothing I say tonight will feel like enough. But I need you to hear it anyway." Roman's expression did not change. "Then say it." Victor wrapped both hands around his teacup and looked down at them for a moment. When he looked up, something in his face had shifted. The last layer of composure, held in place for years, finally letting go. When you were 8 years old, Victor began, I discovered something inside our organization that I was never supposed to find. Roman was still. Corruption, deep enough to go all the way to the top. Men I had trusted, men your mother trusted, were moving money and information to people who wanted everything we had built destroyed. And when I started asking questions, the wrong people found out that I was asking. He paused. They came to me privately, not with a threat, with a demonstration. They showed me photographs of your school route, the time you left each morning, the road your mother used to collect you. Victor's voice remained steady with visible effort. They were not threatening to hurt you. They were showing me they already could. Any morning they chose. The fire shifted in the grate. Nobody spoke. I had one option that guaranteed your safety. Victor continued. Disappear. Completely. Take myself so far out of the picture that there was nothing left to use against me, and nothing left connecting you and your mother to what I knew. If I was gone, you had no value to them. If I stayed, you were a door they would walk through the moment I became inconvenient. Roman's jaw moved once. He said nothing. I staged it to look like abandonment, because abandonment was survivable. A father who walks out is a wound. A father who is finished, and whose family is finished 2 weeks later as a warning. That is something someone does not come back from. Victor looked directly at Roman. I chose to be the villain in your story, so that you would have a story. The silence that followed was the kind that had texture, thick with 20 years of accumulated grief, pressing against 20 years of accumulated anger, neither one willing to move aside for the other. Emily had not moved. Her hands were folded in her lap, and her eyes were on Roman, not Victor, watching the place where the words were landing. Roman stood up slowly. He walked to the window and stood with his back to both of them, looking out at the dark tree line. His reflection looked back at him from the glass, a man he recognized and, in this moment, wasn't entirely sure he understood. You watched me, he said finally. His voice was very quiet. All this time, every year, Victor said, from far enough away that you would never see me, close enough that I would know you were still alive. Roman's reflection stared back at him. Outside, the pine trees held their silence like they were keeping it safe for him. Roman stood at that window for a long time, long enough that the fire behind him burned lower, and Victor stopped watching him and started watching the floor instead, with the patience of a man who had learned to wait in silence across decades. Long enough that Emily got up quietly, added 2 logs to the fire without being asked, and sat back down without making a sound. The room held its breath. When Roman finally turned around, his face had reorganized itself into something that looked almost like calm. Almost. Emily had worked for him long enough to know the difference between Roman's real calm, which was total, unhurried, settled, and the one he constructed over the top of something he couldn't afford to feel in front of people. This was the second kind. It's a good story, Roman said. His voice was level, measured. The voice he used in rooms where decisions were made and no one was allowed to see which direction he was leaning. It explains everything neatly. Sacrificial father. Impossible choice. 20 years of secret watching. He looked at Victor with eyes that had gone professional, distant and assessing in a way that was more unsettling than anger would have been. I've sat across from very convincing people, old man. I've heard very convincing stories. Victor absorbed this without flinching. Emily spoke. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even particularly firm. But it cut across the room with a precision that made both men look at her simultaneously, which was, Roman thought distantly, probably the point. There's something I need to show you, she said. She was already reaching into the bag she had carried into the safe house, the same worn canvas bag she brought to Victor's apartment every evening. From it, she withdrew a package that had clearly been stored with great care, wrapped in oilcloth, tied with string, the kind of wrapping that was meant to protect something from time rather than just from weather. She set it on the table and looked at Roman. "He gave this to me 3 months ago," she said. "He told me to keep it somewhere safe. He said that if anything ever happened to him, I should make sure it reached the right person." A pause. "He never told me the right person was you. I only understood that tonight." Roman crossed the room and sat back down at the table. He untied the string himself. Inside the oilcloth were 3 things. The first was a stack of letters, handwritten, dated across a span of 20 years, addressed to no one. Roman picked up the top one and read the first 3 lines before he had to put it down and look at the ceiling for a moment. It began, "You turned 18 today. I watched you from the car park across from your apartment building. You were wearing a gray jacket I didn't recognize, and you walked like a man who has decided he doesn't need anyone. I was proud of you. I am always proud of you. I'm sorry that has to be enough." Roman set the letter face down on the table. He did not pick up another one. Not yet. The second item was a collection of newspaper clippings, local news mostly, spanning years. Roman's name appeared in several of them, and in the margins of each one, someone had written small notes in pencil. Dates, observations. In one clipping about a business acquisition Roman had made at 26, the margin note read simply, "Smart move. He figured out the thing I never could." Roman stared at that margin note for a long time. The third item was a photograph. Roman almost didn't look at it. He could feel what it was going to cost him before he turned it over, the way you could feel a change in weather before it arrived. But he turned it over anyway. It was a photograph of a man standing outside a school gate, taken from a distance, slightly blurred. The man's back was to the camera, but his head was turned just enough to show his profile. He was watching a boy in the schoolyard, small, dark-haired, 7 or 8 years old, completely unaware he was being watched. On the back, in the same pencil handwriting, "First day, new school." He was nervous. He hid it well. He gets that from me, I think. Roman set the photograph down on the table, looked at it. Emily was watching him with the careful stillness of someone who understands that the most important thing they can do right now is absolutely nothing. "He came to every significant moment," she said quietly. "He just made sure you never saw him. The letters go back to the year after he left. Every birthday, every year." Roman looked across the table at Victor. Victor had not moved, had not tried to press the advantage of the moment or lean toward Roman or say anything at all. He was simply sitting there with his hands around a cold cup of tea, letting the evidence speak for itself because he understood, perhaps better than anyone, that Roman was not a man who could be persuaded. He could only be shown his greatest punishment. Emily said softly, almost to herself, "was watching from a distance while you learned to hate him." The fire crackled. Something behind Roman's eyes shifted, small, almost imperceptible. But Emily saw it. Roman left the safe house before dawn. He told no one where he was going. Not Marco, not his driver, not Emily, who had fallen asleep in the chair by the dying fire, with her canvas bag still clutched in her lap, like she was guarding it even in sleep. He simply put on his coat in the dark hallway, stepped outside into the cold pine-scented air, and stood in the empty track for a moment with his eyes closed. The photograph was in his inside pocket. He hadn't planned to take it. His hand had simply picked it up from the table while the rest of him was doing something else, and now it was there, pressed against his chest, and he was not going to examine what that meant at 4 in the morning, standing in the dark, outside a safe house in the middle of nowhere. He drove back to the city alone. The intelligence reached him by 7 a.m. Marco called while Roman was still in the car. his voice carrying the particular flatness it adopted when the news was bad and urgent and required Roman to be a specific kind of person immediately. "The Ferris aren't retreating," Marco said. "After last night's failure, Dante Ferri has moved personally. He's called in outside contractors, not his regular men. This isn't surveillance anymore." A pause. "They know the old man matters to you. They don't know why, but they don't need to. They're planning one final move." Roman watched the city appear through the windscreen as the motorway gave way to streets. "When?" "Our source says 48 hours. Maybe less. They've identified a location they think the old man is being moved to." Another pause. "They're not far wrong either. Someone talked." Roman absorbed this with the stillness of a man filing information into a system that would produce an answer shortly. "Where?" "The old Riverside warehouse on the eastern edge. Abandoned since last year. They're planning to use it as an intercept point, assuming we'd use that route to move him out of the city." The warehouse. Roman knew it. He had used it himself, years ago, for a meeting he'd needed to keep invisible. It was isolated, accessible from two directions, and completely hidden from the main road by a curve in the riverbank and 20 years of overgrown vegetation. It was, he thought with cold clarity, a good place for an ambush. It was also, if you knew it well enough, a good place to end one. "Tell no one else," Roman said. "And Marco, I'll be handling this one personally." A silence on the line that contained an entire conversation Marco knew better than to have. "Understood," he said. Roman spent the rest of the day preparing in a way he hadn't prepared for anything in years. Not delegating, not directing from a distance, not managing the shape of events from behind layers of insulation. He checked equipment himself. He reviewed the warehouse layout himself. He made the calls that needed to be made and left out the ones that didn't, trimming everything down to what was essential and fast and clean. At some point in the afternoon, he stopped at his desk and looked at the photograph again. First day, new school. He was nervous. He hid it well. He gets that from me, I think. He put it away and went back to work. He brought Victor himself. That part had not been in the plan. The plan had Victor staying at the safe house while Roman's men secured the warehouse perimeter and neutralized the ferry contractors before they could mobilize. Clean, efficient, zero exposure for the old man. But when Roman arrived at the safe house in the early evening, Victor was already dressed and standing in the hallway with his cane and his coat and an expression that required no translation. "I'm not waiting in another room," Victor said, "while my son walks into danger that exists because of me." Roman looked at him for a long moment. "You can barely walk without that cane." "I know this warehouse," Victor said. "I know the eastern drainage entry and the second-floor blind spot, and the fact that the main floorboards are rotten in the northwest corner." He held Roman's gaze steadily. "I used it 20 years ago for the same reason you've used it since. Because I taught you that it existed." Something moved through Roman's chest. Complicated, wordless. He stepped aside from the doorway. "Stay behind me," he said. "The moment I tell you to get down, you get down. Agreed. And if you fall, I won't fall." Roman looked at his father. Old, thin, holding a cane, wearing a coat too light for the weather, and something turned over quietly in the deepest part of him. "No," he said, almost to himself, "you won't." The ambush at the warehouse lasted 11 minutes. The ferry contractors had numbers and position. Roman had preparation, layout knowledge, and something that had not factored into Dante Ferri's calculations, a fury that was no longer cold. Father and son moved through the warehouse in near silence. Roman directing, Victor, unexpectedly, remarkably, providing exactly the intelligence he had promised. The second-floor blind spot. The northwest corner to avoid. the eastern entry that let Roman's men flank the contractors before they had registered the threat. When it was over, Roman stood in the middle of the warehouse floor, breathing steadily, and turned to find Victor leaning against a concrete pillar 12 feet away, cane in both hands, upright, alive. Roman walked to him, stood close enough that the distance between them, 20 years of it, became suddenly, almost violently, absurd. Victor looked up at him. "You came yourself," the old man said quietly. "You didn't have to." "I know," Roman said. He put one hand briefly on his father's shoulder, just for a moment, just enough, and felt the old man's hand cover his. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. 6 weeks later, Roman bought a house. Not a mansion, not a compound with perimeter walls and security booths and the quiet hum of surveillance equipment running day and night. Just a house. A wide, low-built farmhouse 2 hours outside the city, sitting at the edge of a countryside that turned gold in the late afternoon light and smelled like cut grass and something Roman didn't have an immediate word for. Peace, possibly. He had not been entirely sure he would recognize it. The house had a garden that needed work, a kitchen larger than it needed to be, 3 spare bedrooms, and a covered porch that faced west so that whoever sat there in the evenings would have the sun going down directly in front of them. Roman had noticed the porch, specifically during the viewing, had stood on it for nearly a minute, while the estate agent talked about something he wasn't listening to. He had pictured an old man sitting there with a cup of tea and nowhere urgent to be. He had signed the papers the same afternoon. Victor moved in on a Thursday. He brought almost nothing. A single bag, the oilcloth package that Emily had returned to him, and a small framed photograph that Roman didn't ask about, but caught a glimpse of when Victor set it on the windowsill of his bedroom. It was a family photograph. Roman as a young, sitting on someone's shoulders with his arms thrown wide like he was trying to hold the whole sky. Roman looked at it for 1 second and walked back downstairs. He stood in the large kitchen and put the kettle on and stared at the window above the sink while it boiled, watching the garden in the gray morning light, and worked on breathing at a normal rate. Emily arrived an hour later with 4 bags of groceries and the particular energy of a person who had decided that the most useful thing they could do with their emotions was convert them directly into practical action. "The garden needs a proper look," she announced, setting bags on the counter without ceremony. "There's a rose bed under all that overgrowth. I can see it from the gate. And the porch railing on the left side is loose. Someone needs to fix that before winter." "Hello to you too," Roman said. She looked at him with a brief, assessing glance that reminded him she was the only person in his life who had never once been intimidated by him. "Hello," she said. Then she began unpacking groceries. They had lunch together, all 3 of them, at the kitchen table, with the back door open onto the garden, and the smell of whatever Emily had made filling the house with a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was ordinary in a way that Roman found almost unbearable. Not because it was painful, because it wasn't. Because it was simply 3 people eating lunch at a table, talking about the garden and the loose railing and whether the village down the road had a decent pharmacy. Because it felt, disturbingly and undeniably, like something that had always been supposed to exist and had simply arrived late. Victor ate slowly and talked more than he used to. The countryside suited him in a way the gray apartment never had. There was color coming back into his face, something steadier in the way he moved, as though the simple fact of having somewhere safe to be was already doing the work that medicine had been struggling to do alone. After lunch, Roman sat across from his father on the porch. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The garden stretched out before them, overgrown and golden and quietly patient, and the afternoon light moved across it in long, slow panels, the way it only did in places far enough from the city to remember what silence was for. Then Roman spoke. "I hated you for a long time." He said it simply, without inflation, looking out at the garden rather than at Victor. "I built a lot of things out of that. Some of them I'm not proud of." Victor was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "I watched you build them. Then you know what it cost." "Yes." Victor's voice was very steady. "And I am sorry. Not for the choice. I would make it again. But for what it cost you. For every year you carried something that was never supposed to be yours to carry." He paused. "I should have found another way. I told myself there wasn't one. I'm not sure anymore that was true." Roman turned to look at his father properly, fully, without the glass of a window between them or the length of a safe house table or 20 years of constructed fury keeping the distance manageable. He looked at the lines in his father's face and saw time in them, loneliness, love that had nowhere to go for 2 decades and had simply stayed, quietly, waiting. Something gave way in Roman's chest. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. It was the specific, structural collapse of something that had been load-bearing for so long that the body had forgotten it was a burden rather than a foundation. His eyes filled. He didn't look away, didn't press it back down, didn't reach for the composure he had spent 30 years perfecting. He let it come. Victor reached across the space between their chairs and put his hand over Roman's, the same gesture from the warehouse, but different now. No adrenaline, no concrete, no darkness. Just a father's hand over his son's in the afternoon light. Roman turned his hand over and held on. His shoulders dropped first, then his head, and Roman Volkov, feared, untouchable, built from the wreckage of the family he thought had abandoned him, wept quietly on a porch in the countryside, while his father held his hand and said nothing, because nothing was exactly what was needed. Emily appeared in the doorway behind them. She took in the scene in a single glance and turned immediately back into the kitchen, quietly pulling the door to behind her. Not closed, just enough. She leaned against the kitchen counter and pressed her fingers to her mouth and looked at the ceiling for a moment, while her own eyes did something she would not have wanted either of them to see. Then she straightened up, wiped her face with the back of her hand, and started washing the lunch dishes. Some moments, she understood, were not meant to be witnessed. They were meant to be protected. Later, when the light had shifted and the porch had gone quiet, Roman came back inside alone. Emily was drying the last of the dishes. She didn't look up immediately, gave him the grace of a moment to reassemble himself before she acknowledged him. When she did look up, he was standing in the middle of the kitchen, with his hands in his pockets, watching her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Open, unguarded, stripped of every layer he had spent decades constructing. He looked, she thought, like a man who had just set down something extraordinarily heavy. "I need to say something," Roman said. Emily set down the dish towel. "You stopped on a pavement," he said. "A stranger collapsed and everyone walked past and you stopped. You came back the next day. You came back every day after that." He paused. "Because of that. Because of one decision you made that had nothing to do with me. I have my father back." Emily looked at him steadily. "He reminded me of my grandfather," she said simply. "I know." Roman nodded slowly. "But most people walk past things that remind them of things they love. You didn't." She had no answer for that, so she said nothing. Roman looked at her for a long moment. This woman he had employed without curiosity, observed without acknowledgement, and underestimated completely. "Thank you," he said. 2 words, quiet, undecorated, and carrying the full weight of everything they meant. Emily nodded once, picked the dish towel back up, turned back to the counter. "The porch railing still needs fixing," she said. And Roman, for the first time in longer than he could remember, smiled. Not the controlled, functional expression he used in meetings and negotiations. A real one, small and slightly rusty from disuse, but entirely genuine. "I'll fix it tomorrow," he said. Outside, on the porch, the last of the afternoon light fell across an empty chair, facing west, warm and unhurried, waiting for the man who would sit in it every evening from now on. Some things, once found, do not need to be chased anymore. They only need to be kept.